Now I'd like to introduce our panelist for today's broadcast, Parag Seth. Parag has more than 20 years' experience with startups and multinationals, launching companies and products in the North American and European markets. As a director at Radius, Parag serves as a trusted advisor to hundreds of companies attempting to navigate the complexities of international operations. During the broadcast today, we will be tweeting links to assets that relate to Parag's presentation using the hashtag #GlobalGrowth. I encourage you to look for those tweets and to follow us on Twitter at RadiusWW. Over to you, Parag.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. So the agenda for today's presentation is a typical new hire scenario and how do you set up payroll in another country. We're going to talk about a handful of items associated with this as it relates to permanent establishments and what kind of entities you might need. How do you figure that out? How does a revenue model play into the picture? What are some of the HR-related questions that you should think about as you contemplate overseas expansion? If you're sending expats overseas, what are some other considerations that you have to take into account? And then we'll wrap up by looking at some of the best practices as we've learned over the years of doing the business. Next slide, please. So the common scenario is that VP of Sales walks into the head of HR's office with 2 signed offer letters to hire 2 new people in France or Brazil or Zimbabwe. The problem is the company doesn't have an office in France or Brazil or Zimbabwe. And so this is a very common situation in which the director of HR is left with their hands full to figure out how to run payroll for these employees. And it now becomes a fire drill. So the question is, what is it that the head of HR should do first? There are a handful of considerations that the HR director should account for. Starting with, do we need an entity in this country? And if so, what are going to be some of the options, right? Are these employees or these individuals going to be contractors, or are they going to be employees? Because each of these considerations has different implications. And regardless of whether they are employees or contractors, what types of contracts are going to be required? In addition, the head of HR should think about what are some of the local requirements for employment, and we'll talk about how different situations impact the employer. Last piece is, what about managing expats? If you're sending the folks from the U.S. to any of these countries, what are the implications in that scenario? So these are just some other considerations the head of HR should have as they contemplate overseas expansion. Next. So before you, so let's start with this, the company structure and what are some of the considerations there. So the first thing, why does it matter, right? Well, when you create a legal presence in a country, if that is what the employer wants to do, then it indicates a commitment to the market. It sends a signal to the market, especially the employees, if you're trying to hire them, that you as an employer are looking to create a commercial footprint, and you are potentially there for a longer period of time, and it also indicates stability. However, in addition to that, figuring out the type of company structure will also dictate what are some of the registration requirements, how long will it take for you to get set up in that country, and therefore it will dictate when you will actually be able to hire somebody and get them started. The type of entity also affects what kind of activities you carry out in that country. Are you looking to, for example, do just market development, or are you thinking about running sales and business development in the country, or will these folks be software engineers? The type of entity also affects what kind of obligations you have from a compliance standpoint. And last but not the least, it actually affects the overall cost of operations. Once you sort of determine the company structure, you get a broad picture of what the overall cost of running those operations in that country are, and you can thereby determine your ROI as it relates to entering that country. So these are just some other considerations you have as you think about entering the country.